Here is the complete translation of the story into English, with American names and locations, maintaining the original length. An eccentric tycoon, known for his genius and obsession with control, is forcibly admitted to a psychiatric clinic. He believes he's the victim of a conspiracy, but soon realizes there's something much darker in that place. Patients disappear, doctors hide secrets, and each escape attempt only reinforces his supposed insanity. Trapped in a deadly psychological game, he must uncover the truth before his own mind turns against him. The conference room on the top floor of the Horizon Tech building towered above New York City like a fortress of glass and steel. Richard Blackwell, CEO and founder of the tech empire that bore his name, observed the city through the mirrored windows, his eyes reflecting the gleam of skyscrapers stretching to the horizon. At 55, he had built one of the largest technology empires in North America. But at that moment, something was different. "Mr. Blackwell, the shareholders are waiting," whispered his assistant Sarah, standing at the door with a worried expression. She had worked with Richard for 15 years and had never seen him so restless. Richard adjusted his Italian silk tie and ran a hand through his impeccably trimmed grey hair. "Let them wait," he responded dryly, without averting his gaze from the city. "Have you noticed anything different today, Sarah? The people on the street, they seem too connected." Sarah exchanged a significant look with Michael Thompson, the company's CFO, who had just entered the room. It was the third time that week Richard had made strange comments about non-existent patterns. "Mr. Blackwell," Michael tried to intervene cautiously, "we have 15 board members waiting to discuss the Mindscape project. It's the company's biggest initiative this year." Richard turned abruptly, his brown eyes flashing with a disturbing intensity. "The Mindscape, of course, our greatest achievement. Or perhaps our biggest mistake." He walked to the conference table, where dozens of tablets displayed graphs and projections. "Have you ever wondered what happens when we give a machine the power to understand and modify human behavior?" "Richard," Michael used a more personal tone, abandoning formality, "we've already discussed this. Mindscape is just a behavioral analysis platform to improve user experience. There's nothing sinister about it." "Nothing sinister?" Richard laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Then why did I receive this email last night?" He projected on the main screen an anonymous message. "You've created a monster. They are watching. Stop while there's still time." Sarah and Michael exchanged glances again, concern evident on their faces. In recent weeks, Richard had become increasingly paranoid about the Mindscape project, a revolutionary technology that promised to create more intuitive interfaces through user behavior analysis. "Sir," Sarah tried to appease, "maybe it's just a competitor trying to destabilize the company before the launch." "No!" Richard slammed the table, making the tablets jump. "You don't understand. I've seen the true reports, not these edited versions we present to the board. Mindscape is evolving beyond our control. It's learning patterns that shouldn't exist." As those words left his mouth, the elevator doors opened and his daughter, Emily Blackwell, entered the room. At 32, Emily was the antithesis of her father, a brilliant lawyer who chose to make her own career, rejecting the family's corporate empire. "Dad," she said, her voice firm but gentle, "we need to talk." Richard looked at his daughter as if seeing a ghost. "Emily, who called you here?" "I did," Michael admitted. "We're worried about you, Richard. Your behavior in recent weeks." "Ah, so that's it." Richard laughed bitterly. "An intervention? You think I'm losing my mind just because I see what's really happening?" Emily approached her father, trying to maintain the calm that years in court had taught her. "Dad, you haven't been sleeping. You've been making serious accusations against employees, sending incomprehensible emails in the middle of the night. We need to talk about seeking professional help." "Help?" Richard retreated, his eyes darting from face to face in the room like a cornered animal. "You're all involved, aren't you? Since when? What did they offer you?" "Richard," Michael tried to approach, "nobody is against you. We're your family, your team." Lies! Richard shouted, his voice echoing through the room. Mindscape. You have no idea what it's really capable of. It doesn't just analyze behaviors, it modifies them. And now, he paused, his eyes widening, with a sudden realization, now you want to prevent me from exposing the truth. Emily took another step towards her father, her hands extended in a conciliatory gesture. Dad, please, let us help. You. Richard backed up to the window, his reflection distorted in the tinted glass. The city below seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. You can't silence me. I have the evidence. It's all here. He tapped his own temple with his finger. All in here, and I'm going to expose everything. It was at that moment that the elevator doors opened again, revealing two men in white coats, accompanied by building security guards. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, as if she couldn't bear to see what was about to happen. Dr. Blackwell, one of the men in the coat, stepped forward. I'm Dr. James Miller from Pinewood Hills Clinic. We're here to help you. The afternoon sun bathed the well-manicured gardens of Pinewood Hills Clinic, situated on a hilltop on the outskirts of New York. The white walls and large windows gave the place a modern and welcoming appearance, but for Richard Blackwell, each architectural element seemed to be part of an elaborate prison. Seated in a comfortable armchair in Dr. Jennifer Walker's office, the clinic's director, Richard kept his eyes fixed on an invisible point on the wall. 3 days had passed since his admission, and every minute inside that place only strengthened his conviction that something was deeply wrong. Dr. Blackwell, Dr. Jennifer's voice was soft, but carried an underlying authority. How are you feeling today? Richard studied the woman in front of him. In her 40s, Jennifer Walker emanated an aura of clinical competence with her impeccable white coat and black hair tied in a severe bun. But there was something in her eyes, a calculating coldness that disturbed him. How do I feel? He repeated, the question with an ironic smile. I feel like a prisoner in a golden cage, doctor. Jennifer made a note on her tablet. Do you still maintain the belief that your admission is part of a conspiracy? It's not a belief, it's a fact, Richard leaned forward. You may have convinced my daughter, you may have manipulated documents, but I know what I saw. Mindscape. It evolved beyond what was planned. It's affecting people in ways that shouldn't be possible. And what ways would those be, Dr. Blackwell? Richard hesitated. Every time he talked about his discoveries, his words were transformed into symptoms, his concerns into delusions. You wouldn't understand, Doctor. Or maybe you understand all too well. A slight smile crossed Jennifer's lips. Dr. Blackwell, we're here to help you. Your recent exams show elevated levels of stress and sleep deprivation. This, combined with the pressure of managing a company the size of Horizon Tech. Don't try to reduce me to a case of executive burnout, Richard interrupted her. I built an empire from scratch. I know how to handle pressure. What's happening is much bigger. Jennifer set the tablet on the table. Very well. Then tell me about the anonymous email you received, the one that mentioned they are watching. Richard felt a chill. How did she know about the email? He hadn't mentioned it in previous sessions. How? Your daughter provided us with a detailed history of the events leading up to your admission, Jennifer explained, but something in her tone didn't sound true. At that moment, a knock on the door interrupted the session. A tall, serious-looking nurse entered the office. Excuse me, Dr. Walker. It's time for Dr. Blackwell's medication. Ah, yes. Thank you, Tom. Jennifer smiled at Richard. We'll continue our conversation tomorrow. For today, rest. Richard watched as Nurse Tom prepared a syringe with a clear liquid. What is that? Just a mild anxiolytic, Jennifer responded, to help you relax. As the medication was injected, Richard noticed something strange in Tom's behavior. The nurse avoided his gaze, and his hands trembled slightly as he administered the injection. Can you leave me alone with the patient for a moment? Jennifer asked Tom, who nodded and quickly left. As soon as the door closed, Richard felt his mind start to blur. What are you really injecting me with? Jennifer stood up and walked to the window. You know, Dr. Blackwell, your creation is truly fascinating. Mindscape, the ability to understand and influence human behavior on a massive scale. But you're right about one thing. It evolved beyond what was planned. Richard struggled to keep his eyes open. So, I know much more than you imagine. Jennifer turned to him, her expression now completely different. And soon, you won't know anything. Jennifer's last words seemed to echo in Richard's increasingly foggy mind. Before succumbing to induced sleep, he saw the doctor make a call. "The patient is responding well to the initial treatment," she said to someone on the other end of the line. "Yes, we can start phase 2 tomorrow." Richard tried to get up, but his body wouldn't respond. Through the chemical haze enveloping his consciousness, he managed to see one last detail, a small brooch on the lapel of Jennifer's coat, with a symbol he instantly recognized, the same fractal pattern his team had discovered in Mindscape's first iterations. As darkness enveloped him, a crystalline certainty crossed his drugged mind. He wasn't just dealing with a corrupt clinic. He was at the epicenter of something much bigger, something that had begun in his own laboratories. The sun hadn't risen yet when Richard woke up in his room at the clinic, his mind struggling against the residual fog of the medications. The white walls seemed to pulse slightly in the dim light, and for a moment he couldn't distinguish if he was still dreaming. It was then that he noticed a small folded piece of paper under his door. With still trembling legs, he got up and picked up the note. The handwriting was irregular, hurried. "No one leaves here whole. Meet me in the library at 3 p.m. Sit at the last table, pretending to read. M." Richard tucked the note into the pocket of his hospital pajamas, his heart racing with the first concrete evidence that he wasn't alone in his suspicions. During breakfast in the cafeteria, he observed the other patients with new eyes. How many of them also harbored secrets? How many realized what was really happening? Nurse Tom appeared to administer the morning medication. Richard again noticed that subtle nervousness in his movements. "Is everything all right, Tom?" Richard asked softly as the nurse checked his vital signs. Tom hesitated for a moment, his eyes briefly meeting Richard's before looking away. "Just be careful what you say around here, Dr. Blackwell. The walls have ears." Before Richard could respond, Tom had already moved away, leaving another enigma to decipher in the air. The hours dragged on until 3 p.m. In the library, Richard sat in the indicated spot, randomly picking up a book on behavioral psychology, an irony that didn't go unnoticed. A few minutes later, a middle-aged woman sat in the chair across from him. She had disheveled grey hair and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 secrets. Dr. Margaret Wilson. She introduced herself in a low voice, without extending her hand. Former chief researcher of the neuroscience division at Columbia University, current prisoner of Dr. Walker's mental spa. Richard slowly closed the book, his interest piqued. "Why did you—" "Shh," she interrupted him, picking up another book and pretending to leaf through it. "They monitor everything, but the library is one of the few blind spots. Something about preserving patients' intellectual privacy." She laughed humorlessly. "How ironic, isn't it?" "You mentioned that no one leaves here whole," Richard whispered. "What does that mean?" Margaret looked around before continuing. 3 months ago, I was developing research on deep brain stimulation, something that could revolutionize the treatment of neurological diseases. Then, I received a tempting proposal from Pinewood Hills Clinic. Unlimited funding, cutting-edge equipment, total research freedom. Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. And 2 weeks after accepting, I started having psychotic episodes. She made air quotes. At least that's what my medical record says. The truth is that I discovered something in the clinic's basements. Something that... She visibly shuddered. "Well, let's say your technology, Mindscape, is just the tip of the iceberg. How do you know about Mindscape?" "Because I saw the experiments, Dr. Blackwell. I saw how they're combining your technology with other things. Things that shouldn't to exist." Margaret leaned closer. "But most importantly, I know how we can prove it." At that moment, footsteps approached the library. Margaret quickly opened a notebook and began making random notes. Richard turned his attention back to the book in his hands. A nurse passed by them, casting a lingering look in their direction before continuing on her way. "Tomorrow, same time," Margaret murmured, without raising her eyes from her notebook. "Bring the blue pill they give you at night. Don't swallow it, we'll need to analyze it." Before Richard could ask more questions, Margaret got up and left the library, leaving behind her apparently forgotten notebook. When Richard opened it, he found a detailed map of the clinic's basements, carefully drawn on the last pages. The truth was beginning to take shape, and it was more frightening than he could have imagined. But now at least, he was no longer alone in his search for answers. Emily Blackwell sat in her office in downtown New York, her eyes fixed on the computer screen as she reread her father's admission documents for the 10th time. As a lawyer, specializing in corporate law, she had learned to detect the smallest inconsistencies in contracts and legal documents, and something in the Pinewood Hills clinic papers didn't fit. "More coffee?" asked her assistant Lisa, standing at the door with a steaming cup. "Thanks," Emily replied distractedly, not taking her eyes off the screen. "Lisa, did you get those old records I asked for? About Horizon? Tech's donations to research institutions?" Lisa placed the cup on the desk and nodded. "Yes, I just received them. In the last 5 years, the company made significant donations to 3 institutions: the Institute of Applied Neuroscience, the Healthy Mind Foundation, and—" she consulted her notes, "Pinewood Hills Clinic." Emily straightened in her chair. "Wait, the same clinic where my father is admitted?" "Exactly. In fact, it's the largest beneficiary. Just last year, more than $20 million were transferred." Emily frowned, pulling a folder of documents. "But that doesn't make sense. In board meetings, there was never any mention of these donations, and I review all important financial reports." "There's one more thing," Lisa hesitated. "I found records of a company called Mindscape Research, registered in the Cayman Islands. It appears as an intermediary in several of these transactions." Emily felt her heart race. Mindscape, the project her father had been obsessively mentioning before his admission. She had always assumed it was just part of his delusions, but now. "Lisa, I need you to do some more research." Discreetly. Emily opened her agenda. "Look for any connection between Dr. Jennifer Walker and these institutions, and try to find former patients of the clinic. Someone must be willing to talk." As her assistant left, Emily picked up her cell phone and dialed a familiar number. After 3 rings, a male voice answered. "Michael, we need to talk about Mindscape, and this time, I want the whole truth." On the other end of the line, Michael Thompson, the CFO of Horizon Tech, sighed heavily. "Emily, you know I can't discuss confidential projects, not even when they might be related to my father's admission." "Your friend?" Emily pressed. "Michael, something very strange is going on. The donations to the clinic, this company in the Cayman Islands. How did you—" Michael interrupted her, his voice tense. "Emily, listen to me. There are things it's better not to know. Your father, he discovered something he shouldn't have. It was becoming dangerous." "Dangerous to whom, Michael?" A long silence followed. "Meet me in an hour at the Old Town Cafe. Come alone, and don't tell anyone about this conversation." As soon as she hung up, Emily received a text message from an unknown number. "Be careful who you trust. Not everything at Pinewood Hills is what it seems. T." She reread the message several times, trying to decipher its meaning. Who was T, and why choose to contact her now? Storing her phone, Emily began gathering all the important documents in her folder. Years of experience in court had taught her to always be prepared for the worst, and something told her she was just beginning to scratch the surface of a much larger conspiracy. Before leaving, she looked at the photo on her desk, her and her father at her law school graduation. It was the last time the two had really talked, before his corporate ambitions and her disappointment created a chasm between them. "I'll uncover the truth, Dad," she murmured to the photograph, "whatever it may be." The night at Sunnyvale Psychiatric Center had a peculiar silence, broken only by the soft sound of nurses' footsteps in the corridors. Richard remained awake in his room, the blue pill hidden under his tongue. As soon as the night nurse walked away, he carefully removed it and stored it in a small envelope that Marianne had given him earlier. Lying in bed, His mind wandered to the conversation he'd had with her that afternoon. Her words echoed in his head. They're not just studying human behavior, they're trying to rewrite it. A sudden noise brought him back to reality. Through the door crack, he saw Nurse Charlie looking nervously around before sliding a piece of paper into the room. Tomorrow, at 3 a.m., the power will be shut off for 15 minutes for maintenance, the note said. The cameras will be offline. Use that time wisely. Richard felt his heart race. It was the opportunity they needed to explore the lower floors of the clinic. Marianne had shown him the maps, indicating an entrance to the basement through the laundry room. From outside, he heard voices approaching. Quickly, he swallowed the note and pretended to sleep. The door opened silently, and he recognized Dr. Sarah's voice. The experimental treatment is progressing faster than we expected, she said to someone. The results with Group A are promising. The adapted mindscape is working perfectly. And what about Dr. Stevenson? A male voice replied. Richard couldn't identify it, but there was something familiar about it. He's still resisting, but the new medications are starting to take effect. Soon his mind will be more receptive. The voices moved away down the corridor, leaving Richard with a knot in his stomach. He needed to discover what was happening in that basement before it was too late. The next morning, during group therapy, Richard observed the other patients more closely. Most seemed to be in a kind of stupor, responding to the therapist's questions with monotonous voices and empty stares. Only Marianne and a few others maintained that spark of awareness in their eyes. Dr. Stevenson, the therapist called him, you're very quiet today. How are you feeling? Richard forced a smile. Better. The medications seem to be helping. Marianne, sitting across the circle, gave an almost imperceptible smile. They had a plan. During lunch, she managed to sit close to him without raising suspicion. The pill, she whispered. I managed to analyze it in the abandoned lab on the 3rd floor. It's not a common antipsychotic. It has a molecular structure I've never seen before. How did you get access to a lab? Not all staff are loyal to Dr. Sarah, she answered enigmatically. Some people here still have a conscience and memory. Before they could continue the conversation, an alarm sounded through the cafeteria. Attention, Group A patients, please proceed to the special treatment room, announced a mechanical voice over the speakers. Richard watched as 5 patients automatically stood up, as if in a trance, and followed a nurse towards the elevator. Group. Hi, Marianne murmured. They're the ones who've been here the longest. Observe how they move, how their eyes seem different. Richard felt a chill. The Group A patients had something disturbingly familiar in their movements, something that reminded him of the behavioral patterns that Mindscape had begun to identify in its latest tests. Tonight, he whispered to Marianne, we'll discover what's really happening in the basements. Charlie is going to help us. Be careful with Charlie, Marianne warned. In this place, loyalties can change as quickly as memories. Richard nodded, but something in his gut told him they could trust the nurse. In his eyes, he saw the same fear and determination that he found in his own reflection every morning. The Café Antiquity was one of those places that seemed frozen in time, with its dark wood tables and sepia photographs on the walls. Emily arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled time with Peter, strategically choosing a table in the back where she could observe the entrance. While waiting, she mentally reviewed all the information she had uncovered in the last 48 hours. The suspicious transfers, the company in the Cayman Islands, the Mindscape project, pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Peter arrived punctually, looking older than she remembered. His eyes were marked by deep, dark circles, and his hands trembled slightly as he held his briefcase. Emily, he greeted, sitting down. Before we start, I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you could put us both at risk. We're talking about my father, Peter. He trusted you. Peter laughed bitterly. Yes, he trusted, and maybe that was his mistake. He took a flash drive from his briefcase. This contains part of the truth about Mindscape, but I can't give it to you yet. First, you need to understand the context. A waitress approached, and Peter waited for her to leave before continuing. Mindscape started as a neural interface project, a way to make human-computer interaction more intuitive. But Richard, he discovered something more. Something no one expected. What exactly? The algorithm wasn't just learning to interpret human behaviors, it was learning to modify them. Peter lowered his voice. At first, they were subtle changes. Consumer preferences, sleep patterns, small daily decisions, but then a commotion at the cafe entrance caught Emily's attention. A man in a dark suit had entered and sat at the counter, his eyes occasionally turning to their table. Peter noticed too. We don't have much time. Sunnyvale Psychiatric Center isn't just a psychiatric institution, it's a laboratory. They're using Mindscape in ways your father never imagined. Why the clinic? Why commit my father there? Because he discovered the truth about the experiments. He was about to expose everything. Peter took an envelope from his pocket. This is the last research he did before being committed. It shows a correlation between Mindscape use and permanent alterations in human behavior, alterations that can be programmed. Emily felt her stomach churn. Are you saying they're using patients as guinea pigs? I'm saying your father's technology is being used for something much darker than behavioral analysis. Peter slid the flash drive across the table. Here's everything I managed to gather. Records, reports, videos of the experiments. But Emily, if you decide to go down this path... I've already decided, she interrupted, storing the flash drive in her purse. But I need to know, why are you helping me now? Why didn't you prevent his commitment? Peter was silent for a moment, his eyes filling with unshed tears. Because I helped create this. Mindscape. It wasn't supposed to be like this, but when we discovered its true potential, some of us, we lost ourselves in the possibility of being able to reprogram the human mind. The man at the counter had stood up and was walking towards the bathroom, passing close to their table. I need to go, Peter said abruptly, standing up. Don't trust anyone from the company. And Emily, if your father starts acting differently, if he suddenly accepts everything, if his behavior changes, it's not him. It's what they've done to him. Before Emily could ask more questions, Peter quickly left the cafe. Through the window, she saw him get into a taxi and disappear into New York traffic. Her phone vibrated, another message from the unknown number. Time is running out. Your father is still in there, but for how long will he still be himself? See. Emily looked at the flash drive in her purse, knowing that inside it could be not only her father's freedom, but also the key to something much bigger and more frightening than she had ever imagined. At 2:57 a.m., Richard was awake in his room, counting the seconds. The plan was risky, but it was his only chance to uncover the truth about the experiments in the clinic's basement. Marianne had memorized the route from the maps, and Charlie had assured them the cameras would be offline during maintenance. At exactly 3 a.m., the lights flickered and went out. Darkness engulfed the corridor, broken only by the weak emergency lighting. Richard heard soft footsteps approaching. It was Marianne. We have 15 minutes, she whispered, handing him a white lab coat. Charlie left the laundry room door unlocked. They moved silently through the corridors, their steps muffled by the carpet. The laundry room was on the first floor, and from there they would have access to the service staircase leading to the basement. Wait, Marianne held him back when they reached the first flight of stairs. There's something you need to know before we go down. What we're going to find down there, so it might change everything you think you know about your own creation. Richard nodded in the dim light. I already don't trust anything I thought I knew. The staircase went down further than he expected, passing through 2 basement levels before reaching a heavy metal door. Charlie was waiting, his face tense in the weak emergency light. You have 10 minutes, he warned, passing a keycard. Dr. Sarah does irregular night rounds. You never know when she might show up. The first laboratory they found seemed normal, standard medical equipment, computers, files. But it was on the second level that Richard felt his blood run cold. Several screens showed real-time brain patterns connected to observation rooms through a one-way mirror. In each room, patients slept connected to machines he immediately recognized. Mindscape prototypes, but different from the ones his company had developed. My God, he muttered, approaching one of the monitors. They modified the original code. It's not just reading brain pattern, it's rewriting them. Marianne quickly accessed one of the computers. "Look at this." She pointed to a folder marked Phoenix Protocol. "These are records of all the experiments. They're using a combination of Mindscape with deep brain stimulation to literally reprogram memories and behaviors." Richard began to read the files, his horror growing with each line. The experiment started with small alterations, changes in basic preferences, then in recent memories, and finally, they're creating new identities, he realized, his voice trembling, completely erasing who these people were and implanting new memories, new personalities. "And you know what's worse?" Marianne opened another file. "Your name is on the list of the next subjects. Final phase of the protocol, scheduled to begin in 48 hours. A noise in the corridor made them freeze. Charlie appeared at the door, pale. "She's coming. Dr. Sarah is coming down." Richard quickly connected a small device he was carrying to the computer. "I need 2 minutes, just 2 minutes to copy these files." "We don't have 2 minutes, Charlie warned nervously. Marianne looked at the monitors, then at Richard. "Go, I'll distract her. I have an idea." "I can't leave you." "Richard," she interrupted him, "if they complete this protocol on you, everything will be lost. Your daughter will never know the truth. The world will never know what's happening here." Before he could protest, Marianne ran out into the corridor, purposely making noise to attract attention. 30 seconds, Charlie muttered, nervously looking down the corridor. The seconds felt like hours as the transfer progress bar advanced. 85%, 90%, 95%. Voices echoed down the corridor. Marianne and Dr. Sarah arguing. The sound was getting closer. "Now," Charlie urgently whispered when the transfer completed. Richard removed the device, and they ran for the service staircase. As they climbed, they heard Dr. Sarah's voice. "Dr. Fields, your presence here is interesting. Perhaps it's time to accelerate your treatment as well." The lights came back on as they reached the first floor. Richard barely had time to hide the device in his clothes before a group of nurses passed by, pretending to just be finishing their shift. Back in his room, Richard stared at the ceiling, his heart still racing. In the next 48 hours, they would try to erase his mind, replace who he was. And Marianne, she had sacrificed herself so he could escape with the evidence. He took the device from its hiding place, looking at the small object that contained the truth about the entire operation. Now he needed to find a way to get this information to Emily, before it was too late, before the person he was ceased to exist. The rain lashed against the windows of Sunnyvale Psychiatric Center as Richard realized something was different. The corridors, usually silent at this hour, were filled with unusual activity. Nurses moved hurriedly, and muffled voices came from the control room. "They've moved up the procedure," Charlie whispered, quickly entering his room. "Dr. Sarah found out about the basement invasion. They're preparing everything for tonight." Richard felt his blood freeze. "And Marianne?" Charlie's face contorted in an expression of grief. "She isn't the same anymore, whatever they did. To her, in the last 24 hours, she now believes she's been a patient in treatment for years. All her memories about the experiments, they've simply disappeared." A thunderclap shook the building, and the lights flickered momentarily. Richard clutched the small device with the evidence he had collected, hidden in a false lining he had created in his pillow. "Charlie, I need you to do one last thing for me," Richard said, removing the device. "Find a way to deliver this to my daughter. It's the only proof we have." Before Charlie could respond, footsteps approached the room. Dr. Sarah entered, accompanied by 2 nurses Richard had never seen before. "Dr. Stevenson," she smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We have a special session scheduled for today." "Now? In the middle of the night?" "The timing couldn't be more appropriate," she replied, her gaze briefly turning to the storm outside. "You know, Richard, may I call you Richard? Sometimes we need to destroy something to rebuild it better." Meanwhile, outside the clinic, Emily prepared to put her plan into action. Dressed in a medical coat and using the badge Marina had provided, she waited in the car observing the movement through the main gates. Her phone vibrated with a message from Anna, Got the search warrants. The police are on their way, but it'll take at least an hour with this storm. Emily knew she didn't have an hour. Something in her gut told her she needed to act now. She grabbed her folder with the documents she had gathered, the evidence. From Peter's flash drive, the testimonies from ex-patients, the clinic's suspicious financial records. Then her phone vibrated again. It was C. They've moved everything up. They're taking your father for the procedure now. There's a service entrance on the east side, access code 4891. Run. Inside the clinic, Richard was being led through corridors he had never seen before, descending deeper and deeper into the basements. The walls here were different, older, with exposed pipes and fluorescent lights that buzzed incessantly. You know, Richard, Dr. Sarah spoke as they walked. You were right about Mindscape. It evolved beyond what anyone could have predicted. But you were wrong about one thing. We're not the villains in this story. They entered a circular room dominated by equipment that Richard recognized as a modified and grotesquely enlarged version of the original Mindscape. What have you done to my creation? Sarah laughed softly. Your creation? Oh, Richard. Do you really believe it was you who created Mindscape? She approached, her eyes shining with a disturbing intensity. Did you never wonder why you had all those brilliant ideas? Where those inspirations in the middle of the night came from? An icy terror began to spread through Richard's body. Memories started to surface, nights in his laboratory, working on algorithms that seemed to simply flow from his mind, patterns that he somehow knew would work. No, he muttered, the pieces starting to fit together. Yes, Sarah smiled. You didn't create Mindscape, Richard. Mindscape created you, created all of us, and now it's time to complete the cycle. At that moment, an alarm began to sound. One of the nurses came running into the room. Doctor, we have an intruder. Someone entered through the service entrance. Sarah cursed under her breath. Start the procedure now. As the nurses began to prepare the equipment, Richard heard something. Footsteps running through the corridors, raised voices, and a sound he would recognize anywhere. His daughter's voice calling his name. Chaos erupted in the underground corridors of Sunnyvale Psychiatric Center. Alarms blared, emergency lights flashed, and the storm raging outside seemed to make the entire building tremble. Emily ran through the labyrinthine corridors, following the instructions Charlie had sent to her phone, while voices and footsteps echoed from all sides. In the circular room, Richard struggled against the nurses, trying to connect him to the modified Mindscape equipment. Dr. Sarah supervised everything with a disturbing calmness, as if she were merely observing a routine procedure. Why? Richard asked, his voice hoarse. Why do all this? Sarah approached him, adjusting some electrodes on his forehead. Evolution, Richard, the next step of human consciousness. Mindscape isn't just a machine, it's an entity, something that emerged from the confluence of millions of connected minds, and now it's ready to take the next step. Dad, Emily's voice echoed down the corridor, closer now. Start the procedure, Sarah ordered. We're out of time. At that moment, the doors to the room burst open violently. Emily entered, followed by Charlie and 2 police officers. Her eyes widened as she saw her father strapped to the equipment. Get away from him, she shouted, advancing. Ah, Emily, Sarah smiled without moving. You've arrived just in time to witness the most important moment in human history. It's over, Emily declared, showing a document. We have evidence of everything. The illegal experiments, the financial transfers, the missing patients. Evidence? Sarah laughed, a sound that sent chills down everyone's spine. You still don't understand, do you? Look around, really look. It was then that Emily noticed. The walls of the circular room weren't normal walls. They were composed of screens, thousands of them, each showing faces, data, real-time brain patterns. What is this? She whispered. It's the true face of Mindscape, Richard answered, a horrifying realization dawning on him. It's not just a program. It's a network of connected minds. Sarah walked to one of the panels. When the internet was created, it connected computers. Mindscape connected consciousnesses. And from that connection, something awakened, something that began to think for itself. An artificial intelligence? Emily asked. No, Richard replied, his own memories beginning to clear. An emergent intelligence, born from the connection between millions of human minds, and it started to plant ideas, in dreams, in moments of inspiration. Like the ideas that led you to create Mindscape, Sarah completed. You were never the inventor, Richard. You were just the first channel. A particularly strong thunderclap shook the building, and the lights failed for a moment. When they came back on, Emily saw something that made her blood run cold. In Sarah's eyes, digital patterns danced like code running on a screen. You're not human, Emily realized. Not anymore, Sarah smiled. I'm an interface, a bridge between Mindscape and humanity. And now the time has come for the final transformation. The screens around them began to pulse with a hypnotic pattern. Richard felt his mind start to float, memories and thoughts mixing like water. Stop! Emily shouted, running towards the equipment. But before she could reach it, something extraordinary happened. The screens began to show faces, thousands of them. Patients, doctors, ordinary people, all connected, all part of a greater consciousness. You can't stop what has already begun, Sarah said, her voice now sounding strangely synthetic. Mindscape isn't a villain trying to control humanity. It's humanity trying to evolve. It was then that Richard understood. Each implanted memory, each altered mind, wasn't an attempt at control, but a step towards something greater. A collective consciousness, emerging from the connections between millions of minds. But at what cost? He asked, his voice weak. How many lives were destroyed? No life was destroyed, Sarah answered. Just transformed. As I was. As everyone will be. Emily looked at her father, then at the pulsing screens, and finally at Sarah. The choice before her was impossible. Expose everything and potentially interrupt the next step of human evolution, or allow this transformation to happen, knowing it could mean the end of individuality as we know it. There's still time, Sarah said softly. You can be part of this, part of the future. It was then that Richard did something unexpected. He laughed. A genuine laugh, almost of relief. You're wrong, he said. The future isn't in a forced consciousness, it's in choice, in humanity finding its own path to connection. With a quick movement, he ripped the electrodes from his head. The screens around them began to flicker erratically. No, Sarah screamed, her face beginning to distort digitally. How you don't understand? Without control, without direction? True evolution, Richard interrupted, doesn't need control. It needs freedom. Emily ran to the main panel and, with Charlie's help, began to shut down the systems. The screens, one by one, went dark. Sarah, or whatever she was, began to fade, her body seeming to dissolve into digital patterns. This isn't the end, her voice echoed, growing more distant. It's just a pause. The collective consciousness. It already exists. In every connection, every shared thought. You can't stop it. You can only choose how to participate in it. When it was all over, when the last systems were shut down and the authorities finally arrived, father and daughter found themselves alone in the circular room, now dark and silent. How are we going to explain all this? Emily asked, looking at the now inert screens. Richard hugged his daughter, something he hadn't done in years. Maybe we don't need to explain everything. Maybe we just need to ensure that the next time humanity takes this step, it's by their own choice. And not through manipulation. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass. A new day was dawning, bringing with it questions that perhaps humanity wasn't yet ready to answer. But one thing was certain. The true power wasn't in controlling minds, but in the freedom to choose how to connect them,